The house had been quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that settles into walls and floorboards when no one has walked the halls in years. It sat at the end of a curved suburban street, beige siding fading slightly under the sun, lawn trimmed just enough to avoid attention, a place intentionally left unremarkable. Before deployment, every detail had been arranged with precision. Automatic payments were set, security cameras were installed, a property management notice had been filed with the HOA stating the home would be vacant but maintained. The plan was simple: serve, return, resume life exactly where it had been paused. The house was not abandoned, it was waiting. Deployment had stretched longer than expected, months folding into years, time passing in a way that only distance can distort. From overseas, the updates about home were minimal and reassuring. Bank statements showed nothing unusual. Taxes were paid. HOA dues were withdrawn like clockwork. The occasional aerial image on a map app showed the roof intact, the driveway empty, the shadows shifting with the seasons. There was no reason to believe anything had gone wrong. The assumption that things at home remained stable was not optimism. It was trust in systems, paperwork, and the idea that ownership meant control. What no one mentioned was how the HOA board had slowly begun to see the empty house not as someone else's property, but as an opportunity. Board members changed during those years. Elections quietly held with low turnout, power shifting into the hands of people who mistook authority for ownership. The absence of a homeowner became a blank space they felt entitled to fill. Rules were reinterpreted, clauses were stretched. Emergency provisions were invented where none existed. What began as caretaking evolved into management, and then into something far more deliberate. The house stopped being seen as private property and started being treated like a community asset. The decision was not made all at once. It never is. First came inspections justified by vague concerns about vacancy. Then came internal emails about liability and unused homes attracting trouble. Then came discussions about short-term rentals and offsetting community costs. The house, with its clean record and compliant payment history, became the perfect test case. No complaints would come from an owner who wasn't there. No resistance could form against decisions made quietly in meeting rooms. The board convinced itself it was acting in everyone's best interest, and that belief made everything that followed feel justified. While the house changed hands without permission, life on deployment continued under very different rules. Days were structured, predictable in chaos, bound by orders and routines that left little room for personal concerns. The idea that something as solid as a deed could be ignored never crossed the mind. Ownership was assumed to be absolute, protected by law and reinforced by years of responsible compliance. There was no reason to suspect that the HOA, an organization meant to enforce rules, would be the one breaking them. The irony would only become clear much later. The return home was not dramatic at first. There was no parade, no announcement, just a flight landing, a long drive from the airport, and the familiar turn onto a street that looked mostly the same. But familiarity can hide betrayal. The first sign that something was wrong came before the car even stopped. Vehicles filled the driveway. Not one, but several, parked casually as if the space had never been private. The porch light was on in daylight. Curtains moved behind windows that were supposed to be empty. The house was awake, occupied, and unmistakably not waiting anymore. Confusion gave way to disbelief, and disbelief hardened into something colder. This was not a misunderstanding that could be waved away. The security cameras were gone. The locks were different. The lawn, once carefully maintained under a minimal service agreement, was now landscaped with decorative features that had never been approved. The mailbox overflowed with unfamiliar names. The house had been absorbed into a routine that did not include its owner. It was no longer a pause in a life. It was an asset being actively used by strangers. The realization arrived in layers, each more unsettling than the last. This was not vandalism or squatting. The home was clean, organized, professionally staged. Someone had invested in making it livable, rentable, profitable. That meant paperwork existed somewhere. Keys had been issued. Agreements had been signed. Money had changed hands. And all of it had happened without consent. The HOA logo on a small placard near the front door confirmed the unthinkable. This was not a crime committed in secret. It was a decision executed openly, with confidence, under the assumption that no one would ever challenge it. Standing there, the weight of absence became clear. Being gone had not just created distance, it had created vulnerability. The board had filled that space with their own authority, rewriting reality to suit their convenience. They had assumed the owner would not return soon, or perhaps at all. They had assumed that service overseas equaled silence forever. That assumption would prove to be their most expensive mistake. Inside the house, life had been rearranged. Furniture replaced personal belongings. Walls repainted in neutral tones, meant to appeal to short-term tenants. Every trace of individuality had been stripped away, not violently, but efficiently. It was the erasure that hurt most, the casual way a life had been edited out of its own space. This was not neglect. It was deliberate use, and with every step through rooms that no longer felt familiar, a quiet resolve formed. This was not going to end with a complaint or a heated meeting. This was not something that could be fixed with an apology. Too many lines had been crossed, too many assumptions made. The board had operated under the belief that no one would come back to challenge them. They had turned a private home into a revenue stream and congratulated themselves for it. What they had not accounted for was the return of someone who understood structure, documentation, and consequences. As night fell, the house remained lit, active, occupied by people who had no idea what storm they were standing inside of. The street looked peaceful, unaware of the legal and financial reckoning quietly taking shape. The first chapter of this story did not end with confrontation or resolution. It ended with certainty. The certainty that everything taken would be accounted for, and that the silence the HOA had relied on was officially over. The night passed without sleep, not because of jet lag or exhaustion, but because every minute brought another realization of how deep the violation ran. The house was no longer just occupied. It had been administratively consumed. From a nearby hotel room, documents were pulled up, accounts accessed, records downloaded. Years of meticulous organization now served a different purpose. HOA statements showed nothing out of the ordinary on the surface, but absence itself became suspicious. There were no warnings, no notices of emergency entry, no fines, no violations. The silence was too clean, suggesting not neglect, but intentional omission. Someone had decided not to record what should have been impossible to hide. The first calls were not emotional. They were strategic. Insurance providers confirmed no claims had been filed, meaning the HOA had never reported damage or necessity for intervention. Utility companies confirmed changes had been made months earlier, transferring usage into accounts managed through a third-party service often used for short-term rentals. That detail alone reframed everything. This was not temporary caretaking or emergency housing. This was a structured operation, one that required planning, contracts, and confidence. The HOA board had not acted impulsively. They had acted like owners. Public records provided the next layer. A business license had been issued under a name tied to the HOA president's private consulting entity, listing the address as a managed residential unit. The language was careful, intentionally vague, designed to imply authority without explicitly claiming ownership. Rental listings appeared archived on multiple platforms, each featuring carefully staged photos of rooms that once held personal history. The description framed the home as part of a community-managed executive housing program, a phrase that did not exist anywhere in the HOA bylaws. It was marketing fiction presented as fact, and it had generated a steady stream of income. The board meeting minutes told their own story. Buried under landscaping approvals and parking complaints were references to vacancy optimization and temporary utilization of inactive properties. Names were redacted in distributed copies, but internal versions obtained later would reveal everything. Votes had been taken without quorum. Emergency powers had been invoked without emergencies. Legal counsel had been consulted, though no written opinions could be found. Each decision leaned on the assumption that no one would ever question them. Power had grown comfortable in the absence of accountability. There was no rush to confront anyone. That would have been a mistake. Instead, a timeline was built. Every month of unauthorized rental was logged. Market rates were calculated. Comparable damages were assessed. The cost of furniture removal, repainting, lock replacement, and loss of use were documented with professional precision. What began as outrage transformed into something far more dangerous for the HOA, a comprehensive, unemotional record of wrongdoing, the kind that does not threaten, but proves. The tenants themselves were not the enemy. Background checks showed they had rented in good faith, believing the HOA had authority. Lease agreements bore official logos, signatures, and language referencing community bylaws. They were victims of misrepresentation, pulled into a situation they never consented to be part of. That distinction mattered. It shifted liability squarely onto the board and removed any ambiguity about intent. This was not confusion between neighbors. This was an organization exploiting its position to generate income from property it did not own. Legal counsel was contacted quietly, not locally, but from outside the community to avoid conflicts. The reaction was immediate and serious. This was not a gray area. This was unlawful entry, conversion, unjust enrichment, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, layered together in a way that exposed not just the HOA as an entity, but individual board members personally. The words, "piercing the corporate veil," entered the conversation early, and they changed the shape of what was coming. This was no longer about restoring a home. It was about unraveling a system that had abused authority for profit. While the board went about its routines, approving paint colors and issuing parking warnings, the groundwork for consequences was being laid. Notices were drafted, but not sent. Demand letters were prepared, but held. The strategy was patience. Let them continue believing the house was forgotten. Let them continue collecting rent, distributing proceeds, congratulating themselves on their ingenuity. Every additional day strengthened the case. Every new tenant added another layer of exposure. The board had mistaken silence for surrender, and that misunderstanding would cost them dearly. The decision of when to reveal the return was calculated. Too early, and they might scramble to hide evidence. Too late, and more damage would accrue. The moment needed to be undeniable, documented, and irreversible. Cameras were reinstalled discreetly, capturing activity without interference. Mail forwarding records were corrected, revealing the volume of correspondence that had been diverted. Each piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a misunderstanding born of bureaucracy. It was a deliberate act sustained over time. By the end of the second week back, the emotional shock had settled into clarity. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was the center of a case study in what happens when small authorities believe no one is watching. The HOA had built a narrative where they were caretakers filling a void. The truth was simpler and far more damaging. They had taken something that was not theirs, used it openly, and relied on absence as a shield. That shield was gone now. As preparations moved from documentation to action, one thing became certain. The confrontation, when it came, would not be loud or chaotic. It would be procedural, undeniable, and devastating. The board would not be shouted down. They would be dismantled line by line, decision by decision, signature by signature. And when the moment arrived, there would be no room left for excuses. The next chapter would begin not with anger, but with formal notice, and the quiet realization that the game they had been playing was about to end. The formal notice did not arrive with drama, but its impact was immediate and irreversible. Delivered by certified mail, electronic service, and legal courier, it landed on every board member's desk at the same time, removing any chance of quiet coordination or denial. The document was not emotional, not accusatory, and not threatening in tone, which made it far more dangerous. It outlined ownership, documented absence with proof of deployment orders, listed the exact dates of unauthorized entry, detailed the removal of security systems, cataloged alterations to the property, and calculated financial damages down to the dollar. Each page referenced statutes, case law, and HOA bylaw violations, turning what the board had treated as a clever workaround into a clearly defined chain of illegal acts. The notice did not ask for explanations. It demanded preservation of evidence, immediate cessation of activity, and disclosure of all financial records related to the property. The board's first reaction was confusion, masquerading as confidence. Emergency emails flew between members, filled with reassurances that everything had been done by the book, even though no one could point to which book that was. The president attempted to frame the notice as an overreaction, insisting that the HOA's caretaking authority justified their actions, despite the fact that no such authority existed in the governing documents. Panic set in quietly when the demand for financial disclosure was reread more carefully. Rental income had not been placed into a segregated HOA account. It had been distributed, partially reimbursed, partially expensed, and partially paid out to vendors connected to board members themselves. What had felt like harmless optimization now looked uncomfortably like self-dealing. Within days, activity around the house changed. The rental listing disappeared. Tenants were informed that their leases would not be renewed, though no explanation was given. Maintenance visits increased, not to improve conditions, but to undo evidence. Furniture was removed hastily. Decorative elements vanished overnight. Fresh paint attempted to erase the signs of occupation, but it only highlighted how much had been altered. The sudden scramble revealed fear more clearly than any admission could have. The board had assumed control would remain uncontested, and now they were trying to reverse years of decisions in a matter of hours. The tenants, caught in the middle, began asking questions. Their lease agreements were suddenly being described as temporary accommodations. Refunds were offered quietly, accompanied by requests for discretion. Some accepted and left. Others hesitated, sensing something was wrong. Their confusion added another layer of exposure. Misrepresentation had consequences beyond the homeowner, and every displaced tenant represented another potential witness, another paper trail, another liability the board had never considered. Behind closed doors, legal counsel was finally contacted by the HOA, but it was too late for preventative advice. The attorneys asked for documents the board could not fully produce. Meeting minutes were incomplete. Authorizations were implied rather than written. Emergency powers were claimed without triggering conditions. When asked who had signed the rental agreements, fingers pointed in multiple directions, none of them comfortable. The board members began to realize that the HOA as an entity might survive, but they individually might not. Insurance exclusions for intentional acts loomed large, threatening to leave personal assets exposed. The response letter from the HOA attempted to minimize responsibility, framing the rental activity as a community service performed in good faith. It avoided specifics, offered no accounting, and suggested mediation as a path forward. That suggestion revealed more than it concealed. Mediation was not a solution, it was a delay tactic. The refusal to provide financial records was itself a violation, and it confirmed that the numbers would be damaging if revealed. Silence had shifted sides. Where absence had once protected the board, it now protected the homeowner, allowing each misstep by the HOA to deepen the record against them. Parallel to the legal maneuvering, regulatory complaints were filed. State HOA oversight agencies received detailed submissions. Licensing boards were alerted to the misuse of a business entity. Tax authorities were informed of unreported rental income associated with nonprofit governance. Each complaint operated independently, ensuring that even if one avenue stalled, others would continue forward. The pressure was no longer centralized, it was systemic, mirroring the way the board itself had quietly expanded its reach. The community began to notice. Rumors spread about why a familiar rental had gone dark so suddenly. Questions emerged about where the money had gone and why board meetings were now closed sessions. Homeowners who had once ignored HOA politics started paying attention, sensing instability. Trust eroded quickly when secrecy replaced transparency. The board's authority, once taken for granted, began to look brittle. Power that relies on routine collapses when routine is disrupted. By the end of the third week, the situation had escalated beyond control. Subpoenas were being drafted. Forensic accountants were engaged. The narrative the board had built for itself was collapsing under scrutiny. What had begun as a quiet exploitation of absence was now unfolding in full view, with consequences multiplying faster than excuses could be invented. The return that had been underestimated was no longer just physical. It was legal, financial, and reputational. The next phase would not be about stopping damage, but about assigning responsibility. And once that process began, there would be no way to contain it. The first official legal actions hit like a storm. Lawyers delivered motions, subpoenas, and preliminary injunctions, each word crafted to strip the board of any illusion of authority over the property. The homeowner, once absent and powerless, now operated with a clear advantage. Evidence meticulously collected over weeks, documented violations, and the full force of law on their side. The HOA, which had assumed immunity through oversight and bureaucracy, found itself exposed in every conceivable dimension. Every misstep, every unrecorded vote, every unauthorized lease became a weapon. The board members, accustomed to procedural control, were now on the defensive, forced to respond not with influence, but with documentation they could no longer fabricate. The first court filings were procedural yet devastating. Requests for temporary restraining orders demanded immediate cessation of all rental activity and access to the property. Requests for financial accounting required a full disclosure of every dollar earned, spent, or redirected through the HOA's accounts related to the home. The tone was formal, unyielding, and legally precise. Any attempt to argue that the HOA had acted in good faith quickly collided with the undeniable evidence of personal gain. What the board had treated as minor technicalities in bylaws now became major violations with personal liability attached. Panic replaced arrogance. Board meetings turned frantic. Members accused each other quietly, trying to determine who signed which documents, who authorized which payments, and who could be made the scapegoat. The cracks were visible, widening daily. The first deposition took place quietly, without cameras, but the implications were explosive. Board members were questioned about their understanding of authority, the scope of their emergency powers, and the specific steps they took to manage the property. Every vague response, every attempt to claim ignorance, was met with follow-up documentation showing signatures, emails, and financial transactions that contradicted their statements. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet storm of fear and realization. Lawyers took meticulous notes, knowing that each contradiction, each lapse, would feed directly into potential personal liability. This was no longer an organizational problem. It was individual, and individuals were terrified. As the legal wheels turned, financial exposure became clearer. The property had been rented at market rates, with revenue flowing into accounts that were partially commingled with other HOA funds and partially dispersed to vendors controlled by board members themselves. Experts calculated damages, including the fair rental value of the home for the entire period of unauthorized use, plus penalties for conversion, loss of personal property, and emotional distress. The numbers were staggering, far beyond what any member had anticipated. The HOA's insurance, if it could even be accessed, explicitly excluded intentional acts by directors. Every miscalculation, every assumption of immunity, now translated directly into personal financial risk. Community perception shifted quietly but unmistakably. Rumors had begun to circulate weeks earlier, but now homeowners began asking pointed questions at meetings. Questions about oversight, transparency, and ethics. The sudden disappearance of rental income from HOA accounts, combined with the board's visible panic, fueled suspicion. People began requesting copies of meeting minutes, budgets, and voting records. What the board thought was a private dispute was suddenly public, and public perception mattered more than ever. The veneer of authority that comes with familiarity and routine was cracking. The tenant issue became another vector of exposure. Those who had rented the property had legitimate claims of misrepresentation. Some sought refunds, some threatened legal action, and some provided affidavits documenting their interactions with the HOA and the rental process. Each narrative supported the homeowner's claims, creating a multi-layered record of misconduct that could not be easily dismissed. The board's attempts to manage the fallout only created more evidence. Every email sent, every meeting held in private, and every action taken to remove tenants or erase evidence became another documented misstep. The homeowner's strategy remained deliberate. Moves were calculated, measured, and strategically publicized only where necessary. Notices were served, records were subpoenaed, and professional experts were engaged to strengthen the case. Every step reinforced the narrative. The board had acted unlawfully, personally profited from the misappropriation, and assumed wrongly that absence meant silence. There was no anger in the legal documentation, only precision and inevitability, and that made it far more dangerous than any confrontation or shouting match could ever be. Even as the legal proceedings escalated, the board attempted damage control. They issued vague statements, assured homeowners that all actions were compliant, and tried to slow depositions with procedural objections. But the trail of evidence was unbroken, and every delay only heightened suspicion. External investigators began to notice inconsistencies. Internal emails leaked to counsel painted a picture of premeditation, not misunderstanding. Panic deepened, decisions became erratic, and cohesion among board members fractured. The very structure that had allowed them to act confidently in the past now amplified their exposure. By the end of the first month of legal action, the reality was undeniable. The homeowner was no longer a returning soldier seeking restoration. They were a calculated force, methodically dismantling the authority the board had taken for granted. HOA meetings, once a stage for trivial complaints and local politics, became arenas of fear. Board members, who had once operated with impunity, now faced personal and organizational consequences that could extend far beyond their tenure. Every decision made in absence of oversight now had to be justified under scrutiny, and no justification could survive the growing mountain of evidence. The next chapter would mark the escalation from legal maneuvering to financial reckoning. The subtle accumulation of evidence, the meticulous documentation, and the patient strategy were about to collide with the board's misplaced confidence, resulting in consequences that would reverberate far beyond the property itself. This was no longer about reclaiming a home. It was about exposing a system of governance that had failed and holding each individual accountable for assuming they were untouchable. The financial reckoning began quietly, but with devastating precision. Accountants were engaged to trace every dollar that had flowed through the HOA related to the unauthorized rental. Bank statements, ledger entries, and payment records revealed patterns of mismanagement, self-dealing, and outright diversion. Board members had assumed that splitting income between maintenance, administrative fees, and vendor payments would mask wrongdoing. But careful forensic accounting exposed every transaction. It was no longer a matter of oversight, it was deliberate enrichment at the homeowner's expense. The numbers told a story the board could no longer control, each calculation reinforcing the legal claims already in motion. The revenue generated from the home during the deployment period was significant. Market rates for short-term rentals had been applied, sometimes higher than neighborhood averages, and tenants had paid in advance for weeks at a time. That money, however, had been commingled with unrelated HOA funds and partially dispersed to board members' personal accounts through vendor services and consulting payments. Each misallocation became a line item in the growing case. The more detailed the records, the clearer the pattern. The board had not acted out of concern for community welfare, but out of opportunity and assumed impunity. Once the accounting was complete, formal demands for restitution followed. Letters outlined the total financial damage, including lost rental income for the homeowner during the period of unauthorized occupation, fair market compensation for personal property alterations and replacements, and additional damages for breach of fiduciary duty. The demands were precise and unemotional, each figure backed by evidence. The HOA could no longer claim ignorance. Every document, every check, every email now served as a point of accountability. The calculation was merciless because precision eliminated ambiguity. There would be no he said, she said, only undeniable numbers. Board members panicked. Some began offering partial repayments in an attempt to mitigate personal liability. Others argued over who should be responsible for which payments. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors, filled with accusations and fear. Legal counsel advised against voluntary repayment, knowing that partial actions could be used as admissions of guilt. The panic only served to highlight the seriousness of the situation. Authority had shifted completely. The homeowner, once absent, now controlled both the narrative and the legal and financial mechanisms necessary to enforce it. The community watched silently, sensing tension without knowing the specifics. Regular HOA meetings took on a new tone. Sudden cancellations, vague emails about ongoing audits, and promises of transparency that never materialized. Trust in the board eroded quickly, and homeowners began requesting independent reviews of finances. Even those previously loyal to the board began asking questions. The small cracks of procedural abuse had widened into public suspicion, signaling a potential collapse of the board's credibility. Meanwhile, tenants caught in the middle became allies in the case. Refunds were processed, affidavits provided, and documentation of lease agreements submitted to attorneys. Their cooperation strengthened the homeowner's position, creating multiple layers of corroboration that mapped the entire timeline of unauthorized occupation and profit. The human element people misled, inconvenienced, and displaced gave the legal and financial records undeniable weight. The HOA's actions were no longer theoretical violations. They had tangible consequences for multiple parties. The financial reckoning extended beyond immediate restitution. Investigators calculated interest, penalties, and potential punitive damages tied to fraudulent conduct. The board's assumption that a lack of immediate oversight would protect them evaporated. Each misstep, compounded over years, created cumulative liability. This was not just a claim for a single property. It was a case study in what happens when authority is abused and oversight is ignored. The homeowner had not only returned, they had returned with the ability to make the cost of wrongdoing visible and unavoidable. Despite attempts to negotiate, the HOA found itself trapped. Partial payments, excuses, and attempts at mediation were rejected. The homeowner's strategy relied on the principle that clarity and persistence would win, where emotion or negotiation could fail. The board, faced with mounting exposure, realized they had underestimated the consequences of their decisions. The assumption that absence equaled immunity had been catastrophic. Every effort to reduce damage now required acknowledgement of responsibility, an acknowledgement the board was reluctant and unprepared to give. By the end of the month, the HOA's financial vulnerability had become undeniable. Personal assets of board members were now at risk, and insurance policies offered little to no protection for intentional acts. The misappropriation of funds, combined with the legal action already underway, created a perfect storm. The homeowner's patient, methodical approach had transformed initial outrage into an unstoppable financial and legal reckoning. The house, once merely a place of residence, had become the epicenter of accountability and justice. The next chapter would move from numbers to strategy. As financial exposure crystallized, the homeowner would begin orchestrating the broader dismantling of the board's authority, combining legal leverage, community oversight, and meticulous planning. What had begun as a personal violation would evolve into a comprehensive demonstration of consequence, and the HOA would learn that assumptions about power and silence can lead to ruin when faced with methodical preparation and unwavering determination. The ripple effect of the legal and financial action began to spread beyond the walls of the HOA boardroom. Homeowners who had previously paid little attention to meetings or newsletters suddenly started noticing inconsistencies. Questions that were once politely ignored were now asked with insistence. Where did the rental income go? Why were emergency powers invoked without explanation? What authority allowed the board to lease someone else's home? The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from complacency to vigilance. The board's control, once assumed unquestioned, began to erode as curiosity turned into scrutiny. Neighborhood meetings, previously perfunctory affairs about landscaping, parking, and minor rule violations, became venues of tension and inquiry. Homeowners reviewed minutes, requested financial statements, and cross-referenced records with municipal filings. Every suspicious entry, every vague approval that had been buried in paperwork, now came under public discussion. Social media channels and local forums buzzed with speculation. The board, which had believed they operated in quiet authority, realized too late that the community itself could be leveraged as a tool for accountability. Word spread quickly about the house and its unauthorized rental. Rumors about the board's actions circulated faster than any formal statement could contain. Tenants who had been displaced began sharing their experiences online, corroborating the legal claims and providing first-hand accounts of misrepresentation. Local real estate professionals quietly confirmed the home had been rented at above-market rates. What had once seemed like a private dispute now became a story of public concern, drawing attention not just from neighbors but from local media looking for a narrative of authority gone awry. The homeowner, aware of the shifting environment, began using community awareness strategically. Notices of meetings and updates on legal proceedings were distributed carefully, balancing transparency with discretion. Homeowners who might have been neutral allies became engaged, empowered by factual accounts and documentation. Letters outlining financial mismanagement and unauthorized decisions were circulated, not as accusations, but as clarifications. The message was clear. Authority had been abused, and the homeowner was exercising their right to demand accountability. Board members responded defensively. They issued vague reassurances, promised audits that never materialized, and attempted to redirect attention to unrelated issues. But the momentum was unstoppable. Community oversight intensified, and even minor procedural missteps were amplified. Meetings became heated, with pointed questions that board members struggled to answer. Emails, once ignored, were cited publicly. Trust, which had been assumed as a given, became conditional and fragile. The HOA's legitimacy eroded faster than any legal action could achieve alone. External professionals became involved as well. Attorneys for the homeowner invited auditors to examine records, creating official reports that further documented the financial improprieties. The findings were not only precise, they were undeniable. Charts, spreadsheets, and reconciliations outlined the exact flow of funds, the misallocation of resources, and the personal benefit received by certain board members. The community, now fully aware of the stakes, began demanding corrective action. What had once been private mismanagement was now a public accountability crisis. Media attention amplified the pressure. Local newspapers and online channels reported on the story, framing it in terms of abuse of authority, personal profiteering, and homeowner rights. The narrative became one not only of legal violation, but of ethical failure. Board members, who had relied on routine and bureaucracy to shield themselves, were forced to confront public opinion. The reputational damage compounded the legal and financial risk. silence and inaction were no longer options. Every decision would be scrutinized and documented. Tenants who had left voluntarily and those who had been refunded became vocal supporters of the homeowner's claims. Their experiences highlighted the human consequences of the board's actions, providing compelling testimony for both the community and legal proceedings. It was no longer just a question of property rights. It was a matter of ethical governance. The HOA had acted without consent, without transparency, and without accountability, and the impact was felt by multiple layers of the neighborhood ecosystem. By the end of the 6th chapter, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The HOA, once confident in its authority and insulated by the homeowner's absence, was now under unprecedented scrutiny. Community engagement, coupled with strategic legal action, created a multi-dimensional pressure that could not be ignored. The homeowner's return, once perceived as a simple resumption of life, had transformed into a comprehensive reckoning, demonstrating how absence does not equal immunity and how calculated preparation can empower not just an individual, but an entire community seeking accountability. The next chapter would explore the intensifying confrontation as legal, financial, and community pressures collided with board members' attempts to regain control, setting the stage for an explosive unraveling of authority and exposure of the full scope of their misdeeds. The confrontation escalated gradually, like a storm gathering strength before breaking over the neighborhood. The HOA board, now fully aware of the homeowner's organized legal and financial strategy, attempted to reassert control, but every move only exposed them further. Letters, emails, and public statements were carefully analyzed by legal counsel and forensic accountants. Every word, every claim of authority or justification became part of the evidence. The homeowner, who had once been absent and powerless, now operated with absolute clarity, patience, and leverage. Every action of the board fed the case, reinforcing a narrative of calculated abuse of authority. Board members attempted to hold emergency meetings, hoping to craft a coordinated response. They argued over who could speak publicly, who should manage legal inquiries, and how to contain the growing storm of scrutiny. But coordination was impossible under the weight of evidence already amassed. Each member was aware that their own financial exposure, personal signatures, and involvement in decisions made during the homeowner's absence could be used against them individually. Tension mounted in private rooms, while outside, homeowners demanded transparency and accountability. The board's authority, which had always relied on the assumption of silence, was unraveling in real time. The homeowner leveraged every available tool methodically. Certified notices reminded the board of deadlines, legal filings advanced the case in court, and communication with the community ensured that scrutiny remained constant. Every public and private action taken by the board, no matter how minor, was cataloged and interpreted in the context of previous misconduct. Attempts to justify the rental program, misallocate funds, or claim emergency authority were systematically dismantled with evidence. The confrontation was not loud or chaotic, it was precise, strategic, and overwhelming in its inevitability. Depositions intensified the pressure. Board members were questioned under oath about the timeline of decisions, the delegation of authority, and the handling of rental income. Contradictions in testimony surfaced almost immediately, as memories conflicted with emails, meeting minutes, and signed agreements. Every vague response was countered with documentation, leaving no room for plausible deniability. The board, which had once assumed procedural control, was now exposed as disorganized, opportunistic, and vulnerable. Fear replaced confidence, and every action was measured against the looming threat of personal liability. Financial consequences compounded the confrontation. Forensic accountants presented detailed reports demonstrating the exact flow of funds through HOA accounts, vendor payments, and personal disbursements. The calculated damages included rental income lost to the homeowner, penalties for unauthorized use, interest, and additional punitive calculations for misappropriation. The numbers were undeniable, and the board could no longer claim ignorance or good faith. The confrontation was now as much about money as it was about authority. The stakes had escalated far beyond what any member had imagined. The community continued to play a pivotal role. Meetings that once centered on minor complaints were transformed into forums of accountability. Homeowners questioned financial reports, scrutinized meeting minutes, and demanded explanations for every decision related to the property. Their vigilance amplified the pressure on the board, ensuring that any attempt to obfuscate or delay would be noticed. Public scrutiny had become a tool of justice, and the board's reputation was deteriorating as quickly as their control. Legal maneuvers escalated as well. Preliminary injunctions, discovery requests, and subpoenas expanded the scope of investigation. The homeowners' attorneys methodically gathered evidence, cross-referenced it with independent audits, and built a comprehensive case. Each motion filed in court further constrained the board's options, demonstrating that absence had not protected them, but had created vulnerabilities that were now exploited with precision. The confrontation was no longer a question of reclaiming a home. It was a full-scale challenge to the misuse of authority and the enforcement of personal accountability. As the confrontation intensified, board members' personal dynamics fractured. Accusations of collusion, mismanagement, and improper allocation of funds erupted behind closed doors. Blame shifted repeatedly, each member hoping to protect their own assets while the homeowner's case tightened around them. The once unified board was now a series of individuals acting out of fear, confusion, and self-preservation. Every misstep, every defensive statement, added to the mounting evidence of coordinated abuse. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the confrontation had entered a new phase. The board, which had operated under the illusion of authority and silence, faced simultaneous legal, financial, and public scrutiny that left them exposed on every front. The homeowner's return was no longer a personal reclamation. It had become a comprehensive demonstration of the consequences of abusing trust and authority. The stage was set for the next chapter, where legal strategy, community pressure, and financial reckoning would converge to begin dismantling the board's power entirely. By the 8th week, the HOA board's fragile facade had begun to crumble completely. Each board member's attempts to regain control were met with relentless legal and financial pressure. The homeowner, having meticulously documented every unauthorized action, now coordinated with attorneys, accountants, and community advocates to ensure that the board could no longer operate in secrecy. The previous confidence and complacency evaporated under the weight of evidence, leaving panic, finger-pointing, and uncertainty in its place. Every email, every approval, every signature that had once been taken for granted became a symbol of liability. Internal divisions worsened. Board members argued openly, each trying to distance themselves from decisions that had generated significant profits or had violated bylaws. Accusations of collusion, misappropriation, and intentional misconduct surfaced, fracturing any remaining cohesion. Emergency meetings convened in secrecy became sessions of blame shifting, as fear replaced authority. The homeowner, observing quietly from a position of power, allowed the chaos to unfold naturally, knowing that the board's own mismanagement would only strengthen the case against them. Financial exposure reached critical mass. Forensic accountants finalized reports detailing precise misappropriation, including rental income, vendor payments, and personal reimbursements. Calculations incorporated penalties, interest, and punitive damages for breaches of fiduciary duty. Every dollar misused was documented and presented with irrefutable precision. The board had assumed that no one would notice or act, but the homeowner's patient strategy had turned their assumptions against them. The financial reckoning was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, comprehensive, and unavoidable. Community engagement reached its peak. Homeowners attended meetings with documents in hand, challenging the board's authority and demanding transparency. Social media and neighborhood forums amplified the narrative, exposing the board to public scrutiny and further weakening their position. Tenants who had been displaced provided testimony, supporting claims of misrepresentation and unauthorized occupation. The once insulated decisions of the HOA were now visible, dissected, and criticized by everyone from local homeowners to professional auditors. The board's reputation, carefully maintained for years, collapsed under this multifaceted exposure. Legal proceedings intensified. Court filings highlighted every infraction, using clear evidence to demonstrate unlawful entry, unauthorized rental, and financial misappropriation. Injunctions prevented further attempts to occupy, rent, or alter the property, effectively stripping the board of operational control. Each motion, each filing, demonstrated not only past wrongdoing, but also the ongoing risk of allowing board members to continue in their roles. Authority, once assumed and unquestioned, had been dismantled by documentation, strategy, and persistence. Board members attempted damage control, but each effort failed. Letters of apology, partial repayment offers, and claims of good faith were countered with evidence of deliberate action, premeditated planning, and personal benefit. Legal counsel warned against public statements, as any misstep could be used against individuals personally. The HOA's collective power had been neutralized by a combination of legal acumen, financial clarity, and community awareness. Every attempt to assert authority was met with evidence-backed resistance, leaving the board in a state of continuous reactive panic. The personal stakes for board members became clearer with each passing day. Liability extended beyond the HOA as an organization to individuals who had authorized contracts, approved rental agreements, and distributed funds. Personal assets were at risk, insurance coverage was limited for intentional acts, and reputational damage threatened future positions of authority. The homeowner's return, once simple and personal, had evolved into a mechanism for accountability that could affect the lives of multiple individuals. The consequences were no longer abstract, they were tangible, immediate, and unavoidable. By the end of this chapter, the HOA board was no longer a unified entity. Authority had disintegrated, relationships within the board had fractured, and the community's trust had evaporated. Legal, financial, and social pressures converged to create a perfect storm, leaving the board exposed on every level. The stage was now set for the homeowner to reclaim not just the house, but the full control of the narrative, demonstrating that calculated patience, meticulous documentation, and strategic leverage could dismantle even long-standing assumptions of power. The next chapter would follow the homeowner as they finalized the legal and financial victories, solidifying control of the property and ensuring that each board member faced the consequences of their unauthorized actions, completing the transformation from absence to full authority. With the board weakened and fractured, the homeowner's strategy moved into its final phase, consolidating legal and financial victories to ensure permanent resolution. Every detail previously documented now served as leverage to finalize restitution, reclaim authority, and secure control of the property. Court proceedings advanced steadily, motions were approved, and injunctions prevented further attempts by the board to assert control. The homeowner, once absent and powerless, now operated with complete oversight, and every move of the HOA was meticulously monitored. The imbalance of power had shifted entirely, leaving the board on the defensive. Legal victories came first. Injunctions and rulings confirmed the homeowner's exclusive right to occupy, rent, or alter the property. Any previous agreements executed by the HOA without authorization were declared void. The court emphasized that fiduciary duties had been breached, and personal liability was assigned to those board members who had knowingly participated in unauthorized actions. Each ruling dismantled any claims the board might have attempted to use as defense, reinforcing the principle that absence does not justify exploitation. The board's authority, once assumed and enforced through routine, was now nullified by law. Financial consequences were formalized simultaneously. The court ordered restitution of all rental income generated by the HOA during the period of unauthorized occupation. Additional penalties covered interest, damages for alterations to the property, and punitive measures for willful misconduct. Board members, previously confident in their insulation from personal liability, now faced direct financial responsibility. The numbers were staggering, a tangible representation of the cost of their assumptions and mismanagement. Every dollar, every transaction, and every signature contributed to a comprehensive record of accountability. The community played an essential role in this phase. Homeowners, now fully aware of the board's misconduct, attended meetings and provided testimony, reinforcing the homeowner's claims and ensuring that transparency prevailed. Local media coverage highlighted the broader implications, the dangers of unchecked authority, the potential for fiduciary abuse, and the importance of vigilance in community governance. Public awareness amplified the consequences for the board, adding reputational damage to legal and financial exposure. The HOA could no longer operate in the shadows. Even the tenants who had been displaced became key allies. Their affidavits and documentation corroborated the timeline of unauthorized occupancy and rental activity. The human element reinforced the legal arguments, demonstrating that the board's actions had not only violated property rights but had directly affected multiple lives. This multi-layered approach, legal, financial, and social, ensured that no aspect of the HOA's misconduct remained unchallenged. The homeowner's return, once personal, now became a mechanism for full accountability across multiple fronts. Behind closed doors, the board's panic reached a new level. Members attempted last-minute settlements, partial repayments, and appeals, but these were either rejected or rendered unnecessary by the strength of the legal framework already in place. Evidence was irrefutable, calculations precise, and the community's scrutiny unyielding. The homeowner had anticipated every potential countermeasure, and the board's attempts to regain control only highlighted the extent of their prior wrongdoing. Confidence had completely shifted. The board was no longer in power. They were subjects of enforcement. By the end of this chapter, the conclusion was clear. The homeowner's meticulous preparation, patient observation, and strategic execution had turned absence into an advantage. Legal rulings confirmed ownership, financial restitution ensured accountability, and the community's involvement reinforced the broader principle of ethical governance. What had begun as a simple return to a home had evolved into a comprehensive dismantling of authority and enforcement of justice. The board's miscalculations had paved the way for a clear, decisive victory. The next chapter would serve as the final resolution, detailing the homeowner's full reclamation of the property, the final consequences faced by each board member, and the lessons the community learned from this unprecedented confrontation, closing the story of betrayal, accountability, and justice. The final chapter of the confrontation unfolded with a quiet but undeniable authority. The homeowner, having systematically documented every violation, orchestrated each legal, financial, and community-based maneuver to reclaim not only the property, but the principle of accountability itself. Court rulings were finalized, confirming ownership and the nullification of any HOA actions taken without permission. Financial restitution was fully enforced, including rental income, penalties, and punitive damages. Board members faced the consequences of years of misjudgment, mismanagement, and intentional abuse of authority, their personal and professional reputations forever altered. The property itself became a symbol of resolution. Locks were restored, security systems reinstalled, and the home returned to the state intended before deployment. Each room, wall, and fixture reflected not just physical restoration, but the reclamation of control and personal space. What had been manipulated, altered, and profited from without consent was now secured under rightful ownership. The act of returning home, once simple and private, now represented the triumph of preparation, evidence, and strategic patience over abuse of power. The board's collapse was comprehensive. Some members resigned immediately, unable to face legal liability or public scrutiny. Others were compelled to repay personal funds, correct falsified records, and cooperate with ongoing investigations. The HOA itself underwent structural reform. Policies were rewritten, oversight mechanisms implemented, and community transparency enforced. The systemic failure that had allowed exploitation to occur was corrected, and new governance structures were designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The neighborhood, once unaware or complacent, became an active participant in maintaining ethical oversight. Community reaction reflected both relief and astonishment. Homeowners who had observed silently now understood the scope of the violations and the methods of accountability. Meetings became forums for vigilance and education, emphasizing the importance of documentation, transparency, and challenge to authority when necessary. The story of the HOA's mismanagement and the homeowner's strategic reclamation circulated widely, serving as a cautionary tale for communities everywhere. Absence does not mean surrender, and authority, when unchecked, can be exploited with serious consequences. The legal and financial ramifications extended beyond the property itself. Board members learned that assuming silence would protect them was a critical misjudgment. Personal liability, reputational damage, and the enforced restitution demonstrated that actions taken without consent, no matter how bureaucratically justified, carried real-world consequences. The homeowner's patient, methodical approach had transformed a personal grievance into a complete demonstration of accountability. Each action, meticulously documented, ensured that justice was not only claimed but visibly enforced. As the final steps were taken, the homeowner reflected on the journey from absence to authority. What had begun as the shock of discovering unauthorized rental evolved into a strategic campaign of evidence collection, legal action, financial calculation, and community engagement. The process required patience, discipline, and foresight, but it ultimately restored what had been taken and reinforced principles of fairness and accountability. The HOA's overreach was not simply corrected, it was publicly and legally addressed, leaving no ambiguity about the consequences of exploiting trust. The neighborhood itself emerged stronger. Policies were clearer, oversight stricter, and homeowners more engaged. The experience became a shared lesson in vigilance, documentation, and community responsibility. The homeowner's return had sparked not only personal reclamation, but systemic reform, proving that a combination of evidence, strategy, and persistence could challenge entrenched authority and enforce justice. In the end, the house was once again a home. The doors were secure, the community reassured, and the board held fully accountable. The story, while rooted in personal violation, became a testament to the power of preparation, clarity, and unwavering insistence on one's rights. What had started as a betrayal evolved into a comprehensive lesson for all involved, marking the final chapter in a saga of exploitation, confrontation, and ultimate justice.